right, thank you very much. So our experience in dramatically accelerating the pace of change at the British Council. We are an organization that operates in over 100 countries. We are the UK's cultural relations organizations, but we also do a lot of commercial activity, particularly in delivering exams or in the education business. And over the past 7 years or so, we've accelerated the pace of rollout of new products, new projects, new technology, new processes. The time it takes us to roll all of that out across our 100+ countries, from an average of about 22 months, we've brought it down to about 4 months. And what are the key things we've learned in terms of how we've done that? First of all, we've put in a very strong, very robust change management framework, and we've backed that up with a toolkit that includes lots of examples and lots of templates. So that is really strong knowledge management that we've put in place. Every project that we've run over the past 5 to 7 years, we've got the examples and the templates generated from that, and that empowers our team to reuse that. We've really amped out our ability to develop the rollout strategy, the process, the way we develop that, the way we do testing and piloting, in particular putting in place strong checkpoints to decide whether we go or don't go to the next point, impact assessments and briefings, and then, as particularly during COVID, we've completely switched from doing face-to-face training and rollout to doing it entirely self-serve. So I'm going to be talking about a few of these things. We've also developed lots of new capabilities. In terms of rollout, we have developed the capability of doing things in a big bang way that's really accelerated. So instead of rolling out on a country-by-country, business center by business center model, just doing it all in one go. And knowledge management I've discussed. So our implementation framework is modeled and mapped to the Gartner model. So in terms of how it maps through to projects, we go through an initial change scoping. We're looking at things like what are going to be approaches to things like implementation and training, business value, lessons learned, making sure that you always take some time to look at the lessons learned from previous similar projects, because quite often you will be doing lessons learned at the end, but then what happens with that? You need to make sure that that feeds into the next projects, the next initiatives. Training approaches, training needs analysis, stakeholder mapping and impact assessment, detailed comms and engagement plans, and then the whole rollout principles and strategies. So these are all things that we would start doing early on and then continue refining over time. So this is when there is a lot of activity happening in the wider project, in the wider initiative, and quite often there is a temptation at the organizational level to say, well, the change people, the implementation people, they don't have anything to do yet. There's nothing for them to roll out yet. They don't need to be involved in these early stages. But what we found is that it makes such a difference if we're involved in those early stages, able to influence the way the project is being designed and start thinking about those initial change scoping aspects. Then we move into testing and scoping and piloting. And taking the time to really do detailed testing and piloting and making sure that the solution as designed will meet the internal needs of the business or the external needs of the customers makes really all the difference. There is often a huge temptation in the organization to speed through this phase, to roll something out even though it isn't really getting the results you want from the testing, and all that time that you're trying to save by doing less testing or by going ahead even though the testing isn't going as expected. That's going to be time that you then waste 2, 3, 4 times more of it when you're trying to actually implement the change, because you're trying to implement something that isn't fit for purpose. So testing and piloting approach is ensuring that we achieve the readiness, that we do have something that is ready to move into testing and piloting, making sure that we actually take the time to get debriefs, satisfaction surveys, feedback sessions, and so on. And then when we move into the launch and rollout, ensuring that we achieve business readiness, deliver that early life support, and our whole model is based on working very closely with champions that we've set up in the business. And these champions are there all the time. They're part and parcel of how we've been able to accelerate so much. It's all because in a program or project that just comes in, you might be spending 5-6 months just trying to build that network of champions. Whereas if you have that already in place and it's part of the business, then you can just access that and are familiar with the ways of working. So a little bit about how to develop the rollout strategy. There's a huge temptation to just go in, just look at how many business units we have to roll out to, how many countries, how many local centers, and just put that on a project plan. And do it as quickly as possible. What we found is that actually taking the time to develop quite a robust rollout strategy actually makes a lot of difference. So looking at things like, what do we need to do first before we roll out? That's a big one, before we can actually talk about the rollout, have we actually talked about our strategy for testing and piloting? Do we know what the scope of this is? Is this a solution that we want to have in place across all of our business units, all of our geographies, or is it actually going to be a solution that is targeted to where the business need is? And we've found that having confusion on this point can generate a lot of problems. And quite often there's slippage, so you might develop a solution initially to meet a business need in some particular geographies or in some particular situations, and then before you know it, if you haven't defined it properly, before you know it, there's pressure, we should just roll it out everywhere, whether there's a business need for it or not. What are the scale-up scenarios or options? So the fundamental question is, are we going to phase this, or are we going to try to roll it out big bang at the same time everywhere? It's helpful to capture the scale of ambition in terms of timelines. So, if we could do this as quickly as we want to, would we want to have it in by Christmas? Or this is a big one, and we've noticed it almost every year, that a project will get delayed from a technical point of view from a proposed time of, let's say, September, October, and get delayed and get delayed and get delayed. And then you're up against Christmas. And suddenly everybody wants to roll something out by Christmas. So almost every year we have, December 20th, we're rolling something big out. Nobody's around to use it. Nobody's around to support it. Nobody's around to learn anything from it. But it's ticking that box that sometimes is a big thing. So some of the challenges that we've encountered in terms of the way organizations think about rollout in a large, complex global business. One of them is that quite often a key, powerful stakeholder will just come in and say, I think we should just roll out here and here and here. And because that stakeholder has a very powerful voice, it becomes quite a challenge to manage that. So what we found is the importance of helping people pull back a little bit and say, okay, let's just first discuss the principles and the criteria. Okay, so we want to roll out. Do we think we really want to roll out in our biggest geography first, or do we think that there is perhaps some risk mitigation and perhaps we should test out in some smaller geographies first? So pulling back a little bit and thinking about the principles and criteria. Again, there might be times when there will be powerful voices saying things like, we should just roll out Big Bang. And for these, we've really found it helpful and built on our collective lessons learned to develop criteria. We call it kind of Big Bang, yay or nay, to help us realize, is this actually a good project that can be just rolled out on one particular day everywhere across all our business, or is this actually a project that will need to be phased in? And it's quite helpful, again, to help colleagues to pull back a little bit and think about exploring multiple rollout scenarios, what their pluses are, what their minuses are. Sometimes what I found is, again, you might encounter a project manager who just wants to know, do we have a rollout plan? We're perhaps on day one of the project, but we want to know what the rollout plan. We don't really know anything else about the project, but can we have a rollout plan? So again, it's a case of managing stakeholder expectations and mapping out the plan for developing the rollout strategy. So before we can get to that point, here are the things that we need to have in place. So some of the do's and don'ts that we've developed are, it's really helpful to start having those exploratory conversations early, so that some of the expectations, some of the ambitions can be captured, but not necessarily come to commitments early. Insisting on clear governance forums, making sure that decisions are actually made in writing, because there are so many times when decisions are made and then people come away from the same decision-making forum with completely different ideas of what the decision was. In terms of don'ts, it's really important to not sign up to any firm rollout plans before the solution has been tested and piloted. Because really, before the rubber hits the road, before you see what you're actually dealing with, you don't really know if this is something that can be implemented in 1 day or 1 year. And it's really important to avoid any hidden assumptions, because people come away and they just have completely different ideas in their heads. And if they don't share that, some people may think, oh, this is just a 1-hour training that people will need to do, and that's all that's necessary. That's an assumption that if it's not tested and if it's not put out there, it can't be tested. And therefore, there's just not that understanding of how big of a change is this. So what have we learned about when we would recommend Big Bang? That is, just roll it out everywhere on a single day. And when would we recommend a more phased approach? So Big Bang tends to work well when we really have a high level of confidence that if we're talking about implementing technology, but the technical solution itself is mature and stable, that we aren't trying to implement something that's going to require the people on the ground to do a lot of manual workarounds, that we aren't going to be encountering a lot of bugs that are going to need a lot of support. So long as we have that confidence, then that's probably going to be a good candidate for Big Bang. If the change itself is low impact and low complexity, and we're going to talk quite a bit about how we evaluate the level of impact that change has on people. What we've also found is that as a global organization, if the impact is more on our global teams, then it's much easier to do Big Bang. But if the impact is on lots and lots of people at our business unit level, in the country teams or at the actual customer fronting teams, then you can't really push that, because there's so many different teams that are independent of one another that all need to go through the change management journey. Testing and piloting, being thorough and successful, also a key criteria. If, however, the technical solution is being developed in an agile way, in an iterative way, we'll just put something out as a first version, try it out, get some feedback, that's not usually a good fit for rolling it out everywhere, because you're going in with something that's very experimental, that is more about testing a hypothesis. So the risk that you're putting on the whole business to take that very experimental first, second, third version of a potential solution that may or may not be delivering business solution, that may perhaps be exposing the business to a lot of workarounds, to a lot of bugs or incidents or whatever it may be, then we found that this was one of the most important conversations to have with our technical teams in terms of how do we make agile development work for the business. When, again, people at the operational level on the ground need to make significant changes in their ways of working, that is something that usually needs to be phased in. Okay. Just looking a bit in terms of time. So if we do determine that something is a good enough fit for rolling it out on one day globally, to make that a success, some of the key factors are ensuring that we've done sufficient engagement. So people are aware of how the decision was made, they're bought into it, they're willing to give it a go. And of course, there's always going to be some risks, so an acceptance and willingness to take on that risk. Having the basics, and again, they sound basics, but it's surprising how often they're really not in place, of clear governance, clear roles and ownership, having clarity on the stakeholders who are involved. And the more you're trying to accelerate the rollout and happen on one day, the more you need to make sure that the project itself has been well governed and has built enough time for the project stages. There is a huge temptation to squeeze implementation. So one of the challenges that our team constantly faces is, well, you need to roll this out on Monday with training in place, but the solution that you're trying to train on isn't going to be deployed to any environment whatsoever until Friday. So how are the trainers going to, first of all, become familiar with the solution, let alone actually develop the training and then cascade that? So there's quite often a need to manage stakeholder expectations and clarify that you can't really squeeze implementation into happening over the weekend. A little bit about testing and piloting, and we have found testing and piloting to be an absolute critical success factor in accelerating the pace of change. There are a number of reasons why we test and pilot, and some of these are more relevant to some projects than others, but we found it really helpful to have within each project team, initiative team, agile team, to have a conversation about which of these goals for testing and piloting are relevant, and why are we doing the testing and piloting? Because again, there's often a temptation to do it just because it's something that should be done, just to tick a box. And this is particularly interesting about the first point, feedback and input. It's very common that participants in the pilot are invited to join the pilot, and they rightfully assume that they're being asked to pilot something because their feedback is desired. But actually, the project team is sat there and saying, no, this is being mandated from on high. This is going to be rolled out regardless. So really, we're just ticking the box. So we've found that having that really actually open conversation about a team, and making sure that if you are inviting people, or if you are asking people quite often to work an extra 2, 3, 4 hours a day for a few weeks to develop that, to do the testing and piloting for you, that you're actually open and honest with them about whether their feedback is going to be taken into account. Validation and assurance is another very key reason, and quite often that's all the project is looking for. Can I get validation? Can I get assurance that this is good enough, that it will do the job? And again, if the people you're asking to do the pilot for you, they think they're being asked for feedback and input, but really they're only being asked to validate and provide assurance. That's going to be a mismatch. That's going to create problems when you try to roll out, because people will be rightfully saying, well, yes, I participated in this pilot and I gave my feedback, but none of it was taken on board, so why should I take it on board? Sometimes we test and pilot to inform and improve the approach to implementation. And when we can do that, that is really good, because you can actually test not just the solution itself, but the way you deliver training, the level of support, the activities that need to be put into it to prepare the business to take it on board, even simple things like how we collect data that needs to be entered in order to make the system work. And finally, to build business engagement and buy-in. And I think this is something that often our stakeholders forget, that this, for many colleagues on the ground, is the first time that they are exposed to the solution. And this is really the opportunity to kind of open up the box, look at what's inside, and realize or decide for themselves if this is going to help them or not. And if it is, then that's great, and that makes change management later on down the line very easy. Everybody will be very keen to get it on board, especially if you have some people who participated in the pilot who are very gregarious, very vocal, and who will make their voice known in a positive way. That's very helpful. On the reverse side, if you have colleagues who are very disappointed in what they've seen, and whose voice is not really being taken into account, then that's going to mean a huge challenge down the road in terms of implementation. So we've found that having this conversation with the project teams has been very helpful, and kind of, yes, you can achieve all of this, and ideally you would achieve all of these through a well-designed testing and piloting approach. But it does need the whole team to be on board with it. We have also found that there is often quite, there are lots of terminology, lots of different words that people use around this, and they use them in very different ways, and therefore people are talking at cross purposes to one another. So we've done a little bit of work based on the types of projects we tend to run, and come up with this framework just to help people kind of get some clarity between the different ways we might test and pilot it. So sometimes when people talk about testing and piloting, they're talking about that very early customer experience testing, where you're just showing some customers some potential wireframes of what this could look like and trying to get their feedback on it, which is very early in the project, but it isn't really testing the impact on the internal business in any way. This is almost always limited just to end customers. And quite often, it's showing them versions of the product that are very different from what the end solution will be. So that's very valuable, but it doesn't really, and quite often we've had challenges where our more technical colleagues will say, oh, we've done loads of testing and piloting. We've done it in the first few weeks of the project. And they're talking about this, but it's not enough. It's very good, obviously, very, very good to do, but it's just not the end of the story. Then there's the technical quality testing and UAT. And again, we tend to have our more technical colleagues saying, oh, yes, we do this very well. We make sure that our code has been tested for quality in this way and that way and that way, which is, again, brilliant, but it does not replace the need to actually test it with the business and see, not just at the code level, but at the level of the business solution. How does it land for the business? Does it deliver the benefits? And then some of the others that we've looked at are more in terms of, okay, if this is something that's going to be exposed to external customers, how much of a real or more kind of controlled situation are you going to make it? Are you going to make customers, actual customers, actually pay to test this very experimental product? Or are you going to invite them to use it for free and get their feedback? Or perhaps, if it's a very experimental, very high-risk product, are you going to perhaps start by asking some internal friends and family to test that? Maybe some employees, maybe some of their actual friends and family, maybe other parts, other stakeholders who are part of the business network to be part of that testing. So yeah, we found just, and of course, these types of testing will be very different for different businesses depending on the type of activity you're running and the way you interact with customers and so on. But we have found it very helpful to clarify what these different types of piloting might be. Because otherwise people will talk about one and somebody else in the same conversation is talking about something completely different. Now, a little bit about impact assessment. So this is one of the really, really important things that we do in change management. Try to understand what will be the impact of the change. Why do we do that? First of all, because everybody who is involved in delivering the change, the initiative, the project, needs to have a shared understanding of the impact. And that takes work to do, because otherwise you'll have some colleagues who are thinking, oh, this is a very, very light touch change. This is all in the technology will do everything. People just need to use it, and that's all. Whereas the colleagues who are thinking about what this actually means for their activity will be panicking and thinking, well, actually, to make this technology work, we need to change everybody's contracts. We need to, and that isn't something that we can do under legislation in this country, and it's going to create more problems with employment contracts in this country, and so on and so on. Another reason we do this is that we need to plan upfront how we're going to mitigate the impacts. So if we understand what the impacts are going to be, then we can do some of that planning upfront. Otherwise, we would encounter the situations we used to encounter when it would take us 2 years to deliver a global rollout, which was you go and try to pilot, you go and try to roll out, and then you figure out what the impacts are going to be, and then you realize, oh, well, we're actually going to need to wait 6 months in this place before anything happens at all, because there's an employment consultation that needs to happen first, or whatever it might be. Yeah. Also, there's quite often a need to join up with other work or avoid parallel work. In a big organization, this really tends to be a major challenge. And avoid surprises that can put delivery at risk. We have lots of different tools that we can use to assess the impact of change. So some of our favorites are stop, start, continue. And I'm going to show an example of this. Impact assessment surveys, where we develop a survey where we ask key colleagues in the business what they see as the impact of this change. We can do people impact workbooks or heat maps. And a lot of different ways. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. Stop, start, continue has been in our organization the most popular way of doing impact assessment. And what this means is you first need to define your audiences, your stakeholder groups, and then for each audience group, be clear what will they need to start doing, stop doing, and continue doing. And it is a simple model, there's nothing much to it, but actually asking the questions, it is amazing how many times you're just asking those questions and everybody in the project team is looking at one another and nobody can answer the question because the thinking hasn't really progressed to that point. So we find that asking these questions early on in the project really helps accelerate the project because people start thinking about what will this actually mean for people on the ground, rather than purely thinking in terms of features, code, project plans, etc. So yeah, very simple. Define who your audiences are. Make sure you haven't forgotten. Quite often projects will tend to assume that they will have no impact on some audiences, when in fact they will do. If in doubt, it's always better to check with a representative or some people in that group first. And then just clarify, okay, so with this change that we're trying to implement for each group, what will they need to start doing, stop doing, continue doing? Another way to do this is to do a people change impact evaluation workbook, where you're really, again, taking one group, one audience or stakeholder group, and going through a set of defined questions. Things like, will this affect a small amount of people in the group or lots of people in the group? Will there be enough time or not enough time? Is this a small evolutionary step change, or is it a major departure from the way things are done? And kind of add that all up to figure out if there's going to be a high impact or low impact. And then you can also kind of, if you're dealing with a particularly complex type of program with lots of different phases, lots of different audiences, sometimes it's helpful to try to put that into a bit of a heat map, where you're thinking about, okay, so in phase 1, we'll have these groups that are going to see a lot of impact from change, and that's who are going to focus our efforts on. And then these other groups are likely to see the impact later on. And one of the most important things that we've learned is that the impact of change is very much like an iceberg. You tend to see far less of it than what's there, and then you run into it, and then you have problems. So we do ensure through the way we do lessons learned and sharing our experiences across the teams and then with the project teams that we work with, that we keep ourselves up to date with what are the types of impacts that we haven't seen in the past that have emerged in the course of implementing, and therefore how can we in the future identify those early on, because the earlier you can identify the impact, the more you can do work up front to mitigate the impact, and that means you can deliver the change faster. All right. Those are some of our lessons learned from accelerating the pace of change. Thank you very much.